is HD Ingles again, and I want to read to you another episode of Simply Stories, broadcast on the RU Nuts Network. Ha! This episode is about one day while I was teaching an Air Force Advanced Electronics class. A student hit me with a new problem. This is a true story, and by the way, it's a story I really like. Now the story. An unexpected problem. I'm right sure that this story happened after I had been an instructor for about a year, which would put it around 1960. Okay, this is how I usually ran my class. The class period was 6 hours a day with two 20-minute breaks. If I remember correctly, I usually had about 24 students in a class. Each class section lasted 2 weeks. There were usually 2 to 10 older NCOs as non-commissioned officers, sergeants, and the remainder recruits. The NCOs were very serious. They wanted to enhance their Air Force careers and be in a field which would have some earning power after they retired. Makes sense, doesn't it? I usually had good classes, but once in a while I had bad classes. Now let me explain what I call good and bad classes. A good class had, for the most part, students who really wanted to learn. They asked intelligent questions, and actually this was a typical class. The class may have 1 or 2 wise guys in it, but they were easily handled. What that means is a military instructor has a lot of power in a classroom. I could get a wise guy in hot water faster than you could spit. I can't remember more than 2 or 3 of what I call bad classes. They were easy to spot, especially when it consisted of the majority of the students. The typical question I was asked was multiple times a day was, why not just teach the test? I refused to do that, but they learned the consequences of flunking out at that point after already receiving about 4 months of basic electronics classes were not always real pleasant. The material was quite technical and required a lot of concentration. Serious stuff. I always believed that at appropriate times, a little levity would just sort of ease the tension. To that end, after a day or two, I would select one of the brightest students as a victim of my levity. I always tried to choose a student who was not only pretty smart, but seemed capable of laughing at himself. It was always one of the recruits and never one of the older NCOs. And by the way, I only did this in what I call good classes. I would pull something on my victim to make the class laugh at him. And my victim also had a laugh. I forget most of the things I pulled. I had to have quite a few because word gets around. One thing I remember is I would draw a simple circuit on the chalkboard with each of the components being a different color. Chalk. I would look at my victim and say, "What's wrong with that circuit, Jones?" He would study the circuit and finally say, "I don't see anything wrong." I would look at him and say, "Are you an idiot? Can't you see that fuse is blue?" Always got to laugh. Now my unexpected problem. Well, I had a class where the brightest student was a young black man. He was far and away the smartest in the class, and I chose him for my victim. I pulled my "can't you see the fuse is blue" on him. He was the only one who didn't laugh. He just stared at me until it was time for a break. When I called a break, he remained seated and said, "I want to talk to you." That guy blindsided me. He said, "You're picking on me because I'm black." For a minute, I was at a loss for words. I finally said, "That's not so. I then explained how I pulled that stuff on the smarter ones in my class. I told him, if you don't believe me, ask some students who had been in my classes. I remember I pointed to a chair and said, Sarge, who sits there, is barely making it, and it is his entire future. I can't pick on him. We must have talked for about 5 minutes, and we were no longer enemies. We went out and had a cup of coffee and a smoke together. For the rest of the 2 weeks of the class, I zinged him quite a few times, and he laughed along with the rest of the class. You know, a lot of bad situations can be turned around if you just use your noggin. Well, that's it, folks. Thank you for watching.